While one of the candidates in one of the statewide races on the April ballot making headlines today for these comments.
I've said that anyone who engaged in violence on January 6th, assaulted a police officer, resisted arrest, those people should have been prosecuted. That's against the law. They should be prosecuted and held accountable. And judges should impose sentences that are just under the circumstances. Presidents have the power to pardon. President Biden has issued pardons. President Trump has now issued pardons as he's come in. And presidents over history have done that. It's a power they have. I don't object to them utilizing that power.
That is former Attorney General and state Supreme Court candidate Brad Schimel saying he did not object to, you heard him, President Trump granting clemency to around 1,500 people convicted of crimes related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Schimel was asked about comments he had made earlier this month that some January 6th defendants did not get a, quote, fair shot in court. Defendants who were convicted of assaulting police officers were among those pardoned, which has drawn criticism from Republicans, including Wisconsin Congressman Derek Van Orden. Schimel later telling the Associated Press today that anyone assaulting a law enforcement officer should serve their full sentence. Now, Schimel, who is backed by Republican groups in the state, facing Democratic-backed Dane County Circuit Court Judge Susan Crawford in that April 1st Supreme Court election. The winner will determine whether the court remains under a 4-3 liberal control or flips to a conservative majority. Crawford responding today through a spokesperson to Schimel's comments, criticizing both President Biden and Trump for their recent pardons. Quote, presidential pardons of violent offenders who attack police officers and public institutions and pardons of the president's own family members undermine public trust in our justice system and the rule of law. That's just common sense, end quote.